So the market lately, actually going back, this chart goes back to 2016, but shows the difference between the S&P 500, which is the largest 500 companies in the country, versus what everybody calls the FAANG stocks. So Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google, um, which is now actually called Alphabet, but it doesn't make for quite as nice
Yeah.
name, so they stick with the old name of Google. But since 2016 through the recent peak in July, just a couple weeks ago in 2020, 271% for those stocks versus the S&P 500 performing a very respectable 55%. But when we look at those on the same chart, they don't look so great, do they?
Right. Yeah. Not in the least.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
And so interesting about the FANG stocks too was the recent earnings release where they all think the estimates were very close to them. So that was obviously helped the market out quite a bit, especially coming off that bad economic data.
Yeah, yeah, and if you think about what each of those companies does, in a way, they play right into the kind of economy we're in right now, where we're sitting at home, we're watching Netflix, we're watching movies on Amazon Prime, we're doing online shopping because we don't want to hang out at Walmart any more than we have to, and and we're doing it on our iPhones and our iPads and our Macs, and
Sure.
so it makes sense. So a lot of people look at these charts and they really worry about this. And back to what you were saying with what's happened in the last couple of weeks. Yesterday, the day before yesterday, the CEOs of a few of these companies got called in to testify before Congress because they are just so big and so important now that it's kind of we're kind of in this situation where we're relying on these companies, but are we relying on them too much? And be interesting to see how that plays out here. But
For sure.
From a market standpoint, what we've got to watch is that if these are what's driving the indices, if these start to come back down to match, the overall indexes, where does that put us? And so again, it would have been nice to have been able to just invest in those 5 stocks a few years ago. You could have had the most undiversified portfolio in the world and just done incredibly well. But at some point that comes back around to haunt you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to talk about diversification and why it's so important. I mean, if you think pre-2015, if you think about these stocks, some of them, we're barely getting started. Nobody really knew what they were, and now they're kind of leading the charge. And so, but if we talked, 5 or 10 years ago, there'd be a different slew of 5 or 6 stocks that were kind of leading the charge too. And there's no way to potentially pick out what these stocks are going to be. And so, when their cycles are going to go up or down. And so, just the risk in owning those kinds of stocks. And, obviously, it's great for the market. It's great for broad diversification. We're getting the growth out of them.
Right.
But we can't pick who those stocks are going to be. And so that's why it's so important to be diversified.
And to that point, say we were having this conversation in 1958. I don't know the exact years, but say the late 50s, early 60s, if we'd had some way to record a video like this, we'd have been talking about RCA, National Cash Register Corporation, IBM maybe, it would have been an entirely different cast of characters, but there still would have been those 5 to 10 companies that were the darlings of the market at the time, and it's always a rotating cast. A client and
Go ahead.
No, we were talking about Eastman Kodak yesterday. Her mom gave her some shares of Eastman Kodak in the 60s, and we went back and looked because I couldn't remember the timeline, but they're completely worthless now. But that was a darling of the. And another thing about unpredictability. So if you take Netflix for example. So Netflix started as they were the red box that you got DVDs out of to take home for the weekend, right? And if you think about that,
DVDs.
Yeah, yeah, and that model is completely looks silly in retrospect, but
Yeah,
they were able to somehow, adapt themselves to something completely different,
right.
which
And
is
continue
great.
to do that with all the pressure that they have now
Right,
with,
right. But how do
Apple
you
coming out with
predict
theirs.
that?
Everybody has a streaming service now, and somehow
Right,
they're still
right.
doing well.